So, like William said, my name is Euan, and I'm from Altmetrics.com. So I'm going to preface the talk with something that I think a lot of you guys know already, but I'll just reiterate. So Altmetrics.com, we didn't invent Altmetrics, we just have a name that's the same as the field. And there are other Altmetric companies. So I don't have all the answers, and I don't run all of these companies. So some of these people are here, actually. I saw Mike Bushman from Plum. I don't know if he's in the audience, and I see Martin Fenner is in the audience as well. So he's from PLUS. So PLUS do a lot of work in article level metrics. They do an open source system that collects all metrics for publishers. Plum does some work with institutions mostly. Impact Story has an excellent, again, open source system targeted at end users. And then there's us. So I'm Altmetric, not the other guys. Normally I do like a raise your hands if you've heard about Altmetrics before. I think you'd be interested to do it again now. So do raise your hand if you know what Altmetrics is, or you have a good feel. That is, wow, okay, yeah. I really wish, like, you're a metrics company, what I really wish we'd done is, like, counted the past 2 years, like, how many people raise their hands, because that's a lot more. That does make about 10 of my slides redundant, but I'm going to go through them anyway. But what I'll do is focus on, like, why. Why are we doing Altmetrics? Not like the whole, what is it to begin with. So just to reiterate, why are Altmetrics so popular now? Why are we doing them? So there's a few different reasons. The first is we care more about just scholarly impact now. So there's other kinds of impact that people are interested in. When I say people, I mean the people with money, funders in particular. So here's an example of that. This is the REF, the Research Excellence Framework in the UK. This determines how much money as a university you get, and it's based on the research outputs of you as a university. And here is basically just them saying, we don't just want citations and scholarly use, we care about other kinds of impact, economic impact, benefit to society, to the broader society, public engagement, this kind of thing. So that's one kind of axis, we care about these different kinds of impact. And then the second kind of impact is often forgotten about in publisher conferences, because when we talk about Altmetrics as publishers, we tend to think about article level metrics, but actually Altmetrics is the step above that, it's a bit beyond, and it's covering more than just papers. So traditionally, the article is you could argue that the article is the basic unit of scientific progress, if you like. But nowadays there's much more work going on about data sets, pieces of software, even down to individual figures, for example. And there's value in looking at them as discrete research outputs as well. And that's being recognized by funders as well. So this is a blog post from late last year talking about how you can, in your NSF biosketch, start talking about the software and other kind of outputs you're having. The third thing that's coming together to make Altmetrics popular, I guess, is that increasingly now as researchers, as a research community, we work online, right? It's very rare to launch a new print journal, or at least print-only journal wouldn't be a particularly good idea nowadays, and that's because scientists, and academics rather, not just scientists, they discover research online, that's where they consume the content. They discuss it online increasingly, that's what all our systems are based on in Altmetrics generally. And they use the research online. So with tools like Mendeley, for example, they're capturing papers that they want to cite later, and then when they cite them, they're pulling it back out of Mendeley and putting it into a Word document, then submitting it electronically to a manuscript tracking system. So all that stuff's happening online, and there's a lot of it. So I was updating this slide this morning, and shamefully I'm reusing this slide. I used it at SSP, I think 2 years ago. And the interesting thing is, in that top purple circle there, we're saying every day scholarly articles receive about 35,000 new mentions. That's not each, obviously, that's across all the papers. But I updated it from 12,000 2 years ago. So the volume of online activity around articles is increasing at a huge rate. It's very, very fast. Oops. So, given all those three things, here's something else to remember. So different audiences think about impact and assessment in different ways. The reason that people care about more types of impact and about more than just papers is because it turns out that there's multiple stakeholders when it comes to impact, and they all have a different thing that they want to get out of it. And Altmetrics isn't the magic bullet to that. It's not like, and we have the answer, Altmetrics, that's all you need to know, and then, all your problems are solved. Altmetrics is rather an approach. It's a set of tools and a way of thinking about things that help you solve those problems. So I'd encourage you already, if you haven't already, to read the Altmetrics manifesto online. It's altmetrics.org. I think now, if I had to sort of condense it into two things, the two most important fundamental principles of Altmetrics as I see them, don't know if necessarily everyone buys into them, is pretty simple. First of all, let's just take a broader view of impact. The first step is, let's recognize that we want to look beyond just citations, and that authors, researchers care more about just citations. And why do we want to do that? That's the second point. Because we want to help people get credit where credit is due. When I say a broader view, I won't go through all of this, but when I say a broader view, I really mean about everything. I mean about who is it that's assessing a piece of research? Is it other scholars? Is it practitioners? Is it the public? Is it policymakers? And who's talking about it as well? Who's using this research? Talking about, like, how do we assess things? We've kind of flipped back and forth over the past few decades of relying on qualitative measures and then moving more quantitatively. Whoops, I almost lost my laptop. Quantitatively and then back to kind of middle ground. And it's not necessarily one correct answer for everyone. Maybe you need a mix of both. Assessment, if you talk about assessment to individual researchers, it sometimes get a bad rep because it's seen as a managerial top-down thing. That's not necessarily the case. And there's some good talks by Jason Preen talking about this, where it could actually be, why not see it as more of an empowering thing? It's you're giving people the evidence they need to prove that they're doing good work. It's not necessarily just, somebody saying you need 20 tweets per paper, or you're going to lose your job, something like that. That doesn't happen, by the way. But just in case. What outputs, what data, and then when as well. Why can't we start collecting data about articles immediately after publication? Now, the downside to Altmetrics is actually probably the name, and I think, this is one of the points in a document that people will talk about later, I'm sure, but I think it's a better name than anything else we could have come up with, to be honest. But it has two problems. The first is the alt bit, which suggests it's an alternative to something. Actually, it's not really alternative, it's complementary. Nobody's saying citations and the impact factor are useless. That's definitely not the case, because they do have a use. They are very useful for some things. Rather, the types of approaches we're talking about today probably are complementary. Then the second thing is the metrics part suggests that you're going to use numbers for everything. But like we've seen, we're taking a broader view now. We're saying, okay, actually, there's not just necessarily one or two numbers that are going to do it. And also, maybe it's not even the numbers that are important. Maybe the numbers are way into something else. And it's the raw underlying data, finding some evidence of something that's most useful. So that was the background. And I'm going to talk about how people are using Altmetrics now. I'm going to give you some background first on who's using our systems, and then we'll lead on from that. And really there's three main groups. So the first one are publishers, and I won't go into detail about the product, but basically we supply data to a lot of journals to allow them to show Altmetrics information, like where articles are being used and talked about online, and typically that's shown to authors. We also work with funders. That's another major group. So funders have a very different use for Altmetrics than publishers. We'll talk about that later on. And finally, institutions as well. So interestingly, a publisher, each of these things are at a different level. So for publishers, they're interested in article by article level. They might be interested at journal by journal level. Maybe even roll up, publisher by publisher. For funders, it tends to be a set of articles around a particular theme. So say all the papers that came out of a particular grant or program of grants, what kind of impact did the research outputs there have. And then for institutions, it's different again. It's yet another kind of slice of the data in that they're interested in people, departments, and faculty, effectively. So why is a good question. Why are people using the tools in this way? And I think for publishers, it's probably the most simple one, actually. It's publishers, it comes down to authors. For us, they are the primary, they're the people that get the most value out of Altmetrics. And it tends to be for authors that publishers are buying Altmetrics services. So to give you a quick example of how we would do that, so what Altmetric.com does, and the different services do it in different ways, but actually PLOS is relatively similar. So here we have like a little badge down at the bottom left of that article with Altmetric and a little number on it. And if you, as an author or a reader, clicked on that, you would get an article level metrics report, which looks like this. And we've got some visualization stuff on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, importantly, there's all the data behind those numbers. So the actual newspaper mentions and blogs and tweets and all that kind of thing. And there's a lot of interesting data there. So Altmetrics suffers a little bit from being equated with social media, I think, and that's not the case. Certainly social media discussion is like the high volume aspect of Altmetric data, but there's all sorts of interesting things and interesting data you can sort of derive from that. So first is just taking all the basic data and then kind of adding value to it. You know, who are the people tweeting about it? Where are they from? Can we characterize them in some way? There's more nuanced discussion on things like blogs, structured peer review, things like faculty of 1,000, post-publication review, all the way to things like patents and policy documents, which I'll come back to at the end. And authors love this. This is the way publishers realize that they get value for authors is because authors are quite happy to talk about it, especially if their article does well. If their article, nobody's talking about their article, then they're not so happy with Altmetrics. They didn't even realize about their paper. So that second one there is David Nutt. So that's Professor David Nutt. He's sort of infamous in the UK for sticking to his principles, and the government fired him because he had a different idea about legalizing drugs. And there he's saying he's discovered a piece in the Wall Street Journal by one of his papers that he didn't know about before. And authors care about these things for, well, probably two reasons. The most basic one is, I'm going to say ego, and I don't mean it in a bad way. It's this natural human instinct. You produce something, you want to know what people are saying about it, right? It's completely natural. If you have a blog, then you know what I talk about because you probably check how many people have read it, like compulsively. I'm pretty sure that's not just me after you've published it. But as a researcher, actually, the ego is like one of the most important things you can do because you constantly need to prove that you're worthy of receiving grant funding. And in a way, quite rightly, right? Because there's public money coming in, it needs to go to someone, it should be going to the best people. So it's ego, but in a good way. So here's something we've learned, a quick aside about how Altmetrics are used currently. So when you talk to publishers and institutions and you talk about attention around an article, this is the kind of attention that really publishers care about, right? So we're mentioning the New York Times. Okay, that's good. That's a good thing to know. But what we found is actually, because authors are kind of getting engaged with it, authors don't just care about the New York Times, they care about every possible place that might mention their research. And so we deal with the kind of author, like customer support queries we deal with aren't things about, asking about the metrics or like, the New York Times stuff. It's, can you add this mention of my paper on parapsychology today, or crazy things that you would never normally associate with the article. So it can go too far. You can take it too seriously and, kind of, not game Altmetrics, but take it a little bit too far. On the publishing side, the other thing I should say is that Altmetrics aren't the same as article level metrics. I mentioned those two axes that Altmetrics work on. So one is different types of impact, and the other kind is research output. So we work a lot with article level metrics, but actually there's companies like Figshare, and again, Figshare's here, I can see Mark Hannell over there, where there's funder mandates where you need to make research outputs freely available, you need to make things like data sets and software trackable and all this kind of thing, and the services like Figshare that can do that, they should also really be classed as Altmetrics companies, I think. So that was publishers, and you guys are probably very familiar with that stuff already. For institutions, it's different. It's not so much about helping individual researchers, it's more about awareness, actually. So what's surprising, at least to me what was surprising, is if you go to a research communications office in a university, they sometimes don't know that a researcher just published a high impact paper. So if they publish in Nature or Science or something, maybe the press office of the journal reached back to the institution and sorted out a press release, but most of the time, you publish in a smaller journal and it had some sort of mega public engagement impact, the university itself doesn't necessarily know. But the university has a right to know that kind of thing, right? It has its reputation to think of. And it's sometimes tied to funding as well. We talked about the REF exercise in the UK and in many other countries in Europe and across the world. So the way they're using the data is through tools more like this. And this is closer to what Palm Analytics do, where we have tools that sort of aggregate the data up to the person level or the departmental level. So they're able to say, okay, from from the physics department or from the School of Medicine, are there any research outputs that are kind of punching above their weight in different areas? So if you look at the whole spectrum of impact, are there some places that are doing really well in terms of public engagement, some that are really doing well in terms of being picked up by practitioners, some that are doing really well in terms of being cited in patents, that kind of thing. And again, it's being used in ways that we wouldn't necessarily have expected. So two of the main ways, I guess, or the two main ways. First of all, discovery. So the other interesting thing is finding out which articles are hot in different areas. And by hot, I mean, that's the wrong word to use, but which are being talked about most in different areas. And the second one is just collecting all the data in one place, and that's a theme that you can come back to again. It's not necessarily the number, like having 20 blog posts or whatever. It's not the fact that you've got 20 that's important, it's the fact that there's 20 blog posts talking about the paper. And if you go and look at them and what they say, maybe there's interesting things that you can use. It's important to see what the context is. Who is it that's talking about your work and what are they saying? For funders, it's more about finding evidence. I'm going to skip through this one faster. This is an example actually from PLOS, so using the PLOS ALM system. And this slide and the next one aren't mine, they come from Adam Dinsmore at the Wellcome Trust. So I'm not speaking for Wellcome here, but I'll try and do a good job at sort of replicating what he's saying. But here again, the numbers are way in, so they can look at the numbers for this particular article, which is about how the alcoholic drinks industry may have influenced policy in Scotland when it was looking at legislating alcoholic drinks. So if you read this paper, the answer is they did, by the way, just in case you were wondering. But the numbers aren't the most important thing. So they looked at tweets, for example. And okay, it's got a bunch of tweets. By themselves, they don't mean anything necessarily. But when you look a little bit deeper and you see where those tweets coming from, you see, okay, actually, some of them are from MEPs. So that's kind of like congressmen for the European Parliament, if you like. Some central bioethics person, a professor, health journalist, someone at the World Bank. So that is the kind of evidence of impact. It's not proof that the paper has had impact, because maybe these people tweeted it and then never did anything. In the same way that if you have a paper cited by a policy document, doesn't necessarily mean you've had impact, because maybe nobody's ever read that policy document, or they took it and they ticked the box and then they put it in a filing cabinet and forgot about it. But it's a good start. It's information that you could never have gotten from download data or citation data alone, right? It's a place for you to start unraveling some threads. And that's why it's useful. I'm going to wrap up now with a couple of points. So the first is some things that we've learned along the way. So I've said that in the previous slide, but again, numbers are just a way into the data. And it's been quite difficult, actually. We're in new field, we're still learning, but to find a balance between simplicity and nuance. How do you make this kind of data simple enough for people, to make it accessible to people, for them to start being able to use it, but also keep the nuance to make sure that people don't just get the wrong idea and run with things in one particular direction when the whole point is to be, again, taking a broader impact, a broader view of things. I'm going to skip this slide because I'm sure other people will talk about it, and just quickly cover some of the bad things. I'm aware that in this talk I probably said a lot of good things about Altmetrics. There's a lot of work to do still. So some of the common themes that we hear about is, first of all, there's a lack of common definitions. So if you ask any of those four companies by their definition of Altmetrics, I bet you would get a slightly different answer each time. And that's something I'm sure that Todd's going to talk about. Gaming is a problem that comes up. We've seen a couple of people try to game their Altmetrics score. It's pretty obvious when they do, but at the end of the day, it's always going to be easier to pay $5 for 1,000 tweets to talk about your paper than it is to, persuade 1,000 authors to put a fake citation into their data. Some fields are better served than others in the same way as citations. And lastly, there is definitely a bias towards Western research and impact. So the problem is that a lot of the sources that we as Western companies pick up are mostly used by English-speaking people in English-speaking countries. So that's something that we all need to kind of improve on. And I'll leave it there. If anyone has any questions, feel free to email me, and of course we've got discussion at the end. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Euan. It was a good overview. Now, next, well, I should mention first that we have, that not all of the speakers here are